All right, hello. Today we're going to be talking GDP, and our I can statement today is I can analyze gross domestic product, GDP, as an economic indicator, and GDP categories counted. So I've been throwing around this term economic indicator a lot. Let me explain it to you. An indicator means it's like a message, essentially, of what's going on. It is a example of what's going on. So an economic indicator would be like a calculation that we do that tells us how the economy is doing. So gross domestic product, or GDP, is a great economic indicator, okay? So GDP is the measurement of all the sale of final goods and services. There's a caveat though. Made within the United States. If it's made in China, it doesn't count, my friends, okay? So I'm going to be trying to throw you off with that one. You got to remember, it's the sale of all final goods and services made within the United States. And that's the fancy term for it. The down-to-earth term is how much crap we're making, how much stuff we are making in our economy. And it's an economic indicator because it shows us how many factories there are, what people are buying, what people are selling, the supply and demand. It shows us our capital goods, our consumer goods. It's very important to look at how much money we're making selling things, and that's an indicator of how well the economy is doing. And it's also an indicator of how we historically measure recessions and depressions. A recession is, the textbook definition is when we have negative GDP growth for 2 quarters in a row. So for half of a year, we have negative GDP growth, and that constitutes a recession. And recessions can last for a very long time. Think about the Great Depression. It lasted from like 1930 to 1941. And the GDP growth was negative almost that entire time, okay? So I'm going to be throwing around some terms here, nominal and real. So nominal GDP is a calculation of GDP. It's the same thing, gross domestic product. And actually, let's go back to that term, gross domestic product. Gross kind of means like all together, and domestic means it was made here, and product means it's crap that we're making. So the definition is in the term here. So the measurement of all, that's gross. Domestic is within the United States, and product is all the goods and services. You see how the definition is within the word GDP? So nominal GDP, and sometimes we shorthand it and we say in GDP, so we don't have to write out the word nominal, is just the GDP measured in the year that it happened. And we don't do anything to do with inflation. We don't even think about it. So inflation is when prices increase, the level of price goes up, and it means that we have less power in the money that we have. We have less purchasing power because our wages probably didn't go up, but prices of things did go up. Now, nominal GDP just ignores inflation and says, this is the GDP for the year it happened, okay? And it's measured with the following equation. Well, all GDP is measured with the following equation. C plus I plus G plus X. And I'm going to go over what all 4 of those things mean, because I know you're thinking, what do those letters mean? Here we go. So C is consumer spending. This is the largest category. Actually, this is 2/3 of our GDP, almost 2/3 every single year. And it is us buying stuff. That's essentially what it is. It's all the purchase of final goods and services in the United States, stuff that was made in the United States, okay? So I go to Walmart and I buy sheets that were made in the United States. That's consumer spending. I go to college and I pay my college tuition. That's consumer spending. I go to a movie theater and I pay $7 to see a movie. Consumer spending, okay? You buy school supplies at the beginning of the year. Consumer spending. It's all the purchases of final goods and services, stuff made in the United States, okay? Investment. Don't think stocks and bonds, okay? It is not stocks and bonds. What you need to be thinking is capital goods. I'm going to write it right here, and you should write it on your paper. Okay, so think business spending. Well, golly, let me write that too. That was good. Business spending. If I own a car business and I buy a lift or one of those car jacks, that's investment. I'm investing in my own business, okay? So investment spending is capital goods or research that will impact GDP later, okay? Government spending is purchases that the government makes that boost the economy or creates jobs. It has to create jobs in order to be counted as government spending. So if the government is throwing out stimulus checks, well, that's not creating jobs. If the government is building roads, well, all of a sudden they got to employ some road workers. So that's creating jobs. That would be counted as government spending. And then net exports, I should have underlined the X there. That hindsight is 2020 here. The value of exported goods minus imported goods, okay? So when we're thinking about this, we're thinking exported minus imported. And this is because as a country, we want to export more goods than what we import. We want to sell more crap than what we buy. And unfortunately in America, almost always we import more than we export, but we're getting a little bit better about that, okay? So what is not counted in GDP? In C, I, and G categories, it gets pretty complicated, and I'm going to try and boil it down for you to a high school level and not a college level. So what is not counted? In the consumer spending category, things that we buy from other countries, all your clothing that is on your back right now, if you look at the tag, almost guaranteed it's from China or Malaysia or Indonesia, somewhere in Southeast Asia, okay? That doesn't count because it wasn't made in America. It was just sold in America. We imported it. So that would be part of the net exports, okay? Products bought that are made from other products and then sold. So this would include, here's a good example. Yarn for a knitted hat that will be sold. I go to the store, I buy yarn. Okay, cool. If I'm just going to use the yarn and not sell it or anything, that's consumer spending. If I'm going to use the yarn to knit a hat that's going to be sold, that doesn't count as consumer spending. The final hat that is sold counts as consumer spending. The yarn is considered an intermediate good because it will go into the product that's being sold. I know that's like super complicated. And then used goods do not count. And how about you highlight used goods? Because that's pretty important. You buy a used car? Nope, doesn't count because we counted it in the GDP when it was new. You buy a used house, which is funny to think about a house as used, but you buy a house that is not brand new, like just built by a contractor? Nope, doesn't count because we've already counted it in the GDP. Used clothing. I go to Goodwill all the time. That's where I get all my clothes. That doesn't count in the GDP. It was counted in the GDP when it was originally sold. Okay? Let's talk about I. What is not counted in investment category, the capital spending category? When you think investment, you probably think the purchase of stocks and bonds, right? I'm investing in a company because I'm buying stock in the company. That doesn't count in the GDP, okay? It doesn't count because that money will be counted later when the goods made from that purchase of stock are made and then sold in the consumer spending category. I know that is so confusing, okay? But when you see stocks and bonds, think, nope, not counted in the GDP. That means that most of our retirement funds, our 401ks, there's millions of dollars in 401ks, it's not counted in the GDP because it will be counted later when we cash out those retirement funds and go and spend money. That'd be consumer spending, okay? When companies buy each other, they are buying out all the stock of the other company. And since it's stock, that does not count in the investment category, okay? That doesn't count towards GDP. And when it comes to government spending, what does not count in the government spending category? If the government does something that does not create jobs or does not create new goods or services. So think like unemployment checks, social security checks, disability checks. Those don't count towards the GDP. Now, later on, when grandma gets her social security check and goes and spends it on sweaters for her cats, I don't know, that will count for consumer spending, but just the check in the mail to her does not count. Government salaries don't count. Me as a teacher, even though I provide a service to you, the government paying my salary does not count in the GDP because they're going to count my salary later when it comes to me buying things, consumer spending. Or like scholarships. Sometimes the government provides scholarships. I went to school on a government scholarship. That doesn't count towards the GDP. Okay? All right, so let's practice on what is counted and not counted with some of these examples. We're going to go from left to right here. A stay-at-home mom cares for her kids. Beautiful, wonderful, great. Has nothing to do with GDP. It's not counted. A baker buys a new oven. That is counted in the GDP, right? Miss Keller buys an iPhone case from China. That's an import, so it's counted. Even though it'll hurt our GDP, it's counted. A used car, we've already counted it in the GDP when it was sold, when it was new, so it is not counted anymore. College tuition payment, if you are paying a college for a good or service, that is counted in the GDP. The purchase of stock is not counted in the GDP. Social security check, it's not creating jobs, not counted. A lawn care worker buys parts to fix his trailer that hauls mowers. He's buying parts to invest in his own business. That's counted in the GDP. And a nail salon technician's income. People are paying her to do their nails. That is counted in the GDP. Okay, so hopefully those examples kind of shed some light on things. Now, let's put some of those examples and then maybe some new ones into categories here. So, let's go from left to right. A factory automated the assembly line. So the factory is investing in capital goods. That's investment spending. Okay, a baker purchasing an oven. She's investing in her own business, right? Investment spending. The government spending $1 billion on an airplane fleet. We have to think, did this government spending create jobs? Yeah, people had to build those airplanes. So that is government spending. Okay, Mrs. K buys a t-shirt from Walmart that was made in America. Oop, it was made within U.S. borders and one person bought it. It's consumer spending. A family pays $100,000 for a new house. I know you're going to want to put that in consumer spending, right? A family is spending money. They're consuming a house. But don't think about owning a house like consuming a house. You don't consume it and run it into the ground until it's dead. A house is an investment. It's one of the very few things, houses and land are one of the very few things that you can buy that don't depreciate in value. Their value actually goes up. So buying a house is actually an investment, an economic investment, because that house is going to go up in value and you can sell it later. So it is counted in GDP, but it's not consumer spending. It's an investment. If it were an old house, if it were a used house, it wouldn't count at all. Okay, mom buys sugar for her son's birthday cake. Consumer spending. An oil company in Alaska exports to Russia. Net exports. The government built a new heating and air system at ACHS. Now think, did this government spending create jobs? Yes. We've had construction workers in our building forever. Government spending. A nail salon purchases nail polish. They're going to use that to make money. That's a capital good. Investment. Okay? All right. Let's talk real quick about consumer spending. Consumer spending is kind of hard to understand because we can't double count things. Remember, like my example about a car? We count a car in the GDP the first time the car was sold, but not the second time or the third time or the fourth time. So consumer spending doesn't include used goods because that would be double counting those goods. Those goods have already been counted when they were originally sold, like houses, used clothing, used cars. We also have to be careful of intermediate goods, and I'm going to write that down. They're called intermediate goods. And intermediate goods is essentially a good that goes into the making of another good that's going to be sold. So again, my example is if I buy yarn for a knitted hat and I'm going to end up selling the knitted hat, it's not just for myself. It's not just to wear to a football game. I'm going to end up selling that knitted hat. That yarn doesn't count as consumer spending It doesn't count as investment spending either because it ends up in the final product that is sold. It's an intermediate good and thus isn't counted in the GDP. Just the final product, just the hat itself is counted in the GDP. So consumer spending is really, really hard for economists to calculate, especially since we're looking at the whole country, okay? All right, so whip out those calculators, my friends. You're going to need them for this one, okay? And we're going to do some small numbers. Now, we can pretend that there's like a million off to the side on here, but GDP is usually in like millions and trillions and billions of dollars. You and I are going to do it in small numbers because small numbers are much easier to work with. So remember, our formula is C plus I plus G plus X, and that's our nominal GDP, and that's very easy to figure out. So consumer spending was 400 plus investment I is 20 plus government spending was 200 plus imports and exports. Remember, our net exports were exports minus imports. So 45 minus 25 is 20. So all of this minus 20. Okay, so whip out those calculators for me. It's a lot easier that way. Plus 200 is 620 minus, plus our net exports, which was 45 minus 25. Okay, so 620 plus 20 equals 640, and our GDP was 640, okay? All right, let's do it again. Here we go. So C plus I plus G plus X, 550 plus 150 plus 300. There's the C plus I plus G. So 550 plus 150 plus 300 equals 1,000 plus our net exports. And net exports is exports minus imports. So we've got 60 minus 35. Let's write that in here. 60, ooh, green. 60 minus 35 is 25. So 1,000 plus 25, we've got 1,025 is our nominal GDP. That looks like GPP. I'm so sorry. It's late at night. Okay. Last practice here. Get those calculators ready. C plus I plus G plus X. 450 plus 5 plus 250. Okay, there's the C plus I plus G. We did 450 plus 5 plus 250 equals 705 plus our next net exports, which is 55 minus 30. 55 minus 30. Okay, so 705 plus 25 equals 730. So our nominal GDP is 730. And that's how we calculate nominal GDP. All right, and that's all we have today. We'll talk about GDP and inflation another day.